Let's hear the word of the Lord. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, after one in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who is in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now, and she has been sitting in the house for a little while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." This is the word of the Lord. Let's pray together. Lord, as we look at this beautiful passage, as the book of Ruth takes a positive turn, help us to see you. Help us to see your love, your care, your compassion for us, your favor over us, Lord. Help us to learn from you today through your word. Teach us now. In your name I pray. Amen. And so, now we turn to a positive side of Ruth. The past 2 weeks, if you've been with us, have been rather dark, difficult, a bit depressing in some ways. But last week we saw that Naomi decided to go back to Bethlehem, to return to her people. And Ruth joined her. And in that journey back, Ruth said, "I will devote my life to Naomi, to the people of God, and to God himself." Within that, you see a bit of the bitterness of Naomi and the difficulty she was going through and the loss of her husband and her 2 sons. But we see great commitment from Ruth. And Ruth chooses to leave her people, her land, and the gods of Moab, to go to a new place and a new people. And this week I couldn't help but think about the story of Abraham. If you don't know the story of Abraham, Abraham was asked by God to leave his people, to go to a place that he didn't know, and to follow Yahweh, the one true God. And you see this in Genesis 12, verses 1 and 2. "And the Lord said to Abram, 'Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing.'" Well, the interesting thing about Abraham God makes this covenant promise. He says, leave your people, leave your land, leave your wealth, and go to a place that I'll show you, and follow me, the one true God, Yahweh. And through that, I promise to make you a great nation. And now we get to Ruth, and Ruth leaves her people just like Abraham did, leaves the land that she knows, and follows Yahweh, the one true God. And as we'll see, as the story continues, she gets to join into this promise made to Abraham. She becomes part of the line of God blessing the nations, making them a great nation, and being a blessing to others. And so we'll see that, a glimpse of that today. I couldn't help but think of that connection between Ruth and Abraham in this way. And so, before we look at our text for today specifically, I want us to think about the big idea. If I could try to summarize our passage in one sentence, this is what I would say. As Christians, we seek God's favor under the refuge of his wings. As Christians, we seek God's favor under the refuge of his wings. And understand this terminology of favor and blessing is oftentimes misused in the Christian world now. There's a prosperity gospel that oftentimes says that we should seek the blessing and favor of God and he'll give us whatever we want. But I hope we see through this passage today that actually a biblical understanding of favor and blessing is sometimes God giving you the very thing you want least, but what you actually need. The thing you least expected. But God knows in his favor and care and compassion, it's actually what you need, but not necessarily what you want. And ultimately, we can only receive the favor of God when we find refuge beneath his wings, when we find refuge beneath the care of God. And so, favor is in many ways the focus of this, the loving kindness of God. So we'll look at this in three different scenes. As last week, we saw the scene of, as I said last week, we almost view this like a play. You're watching each scene, and they're talking back and forth, and you have these characters. And last week, we saw Naomi and Ruth and Orpah on their return back to Bethlehem. You see Orpah go back to her people. You see Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem. And then this week, we ended last week with this statement. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. You got a glimmer of, well, what's the barley harvest going to bring? What is coming with the barley harvest? And thankfully, we get to see this week. And we're going to look at three different scenes where we see aspects of favor. And first, we'll look here in verses 1 through 7, seeking favor in the fields. And so we start with verse 1. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And as we read this earlier, it may even sound a bit strange. It starts with this statement about a relative of Naomi, someone of her husband's family line, and his name is Boaz. So we're introduced to a new character here that we haven't heard of previously. But then it seems to change the subject, and it talks about Ruth in verse 2. And then in verse 3, at the end of verse 3, it returns to Boaz, and it talks about, once again, of the family of Elimelech. It seems a bit repetitive and redundant. And you may say, why would he repeat it? Why would the author repeat himself here? And in my study this week, I found something very interesting. Oftentimes in the ancient Near East writing, when there was repetition that had an aspect of redundancy to it, it was the author's way of saying, pay attention to this. This is important for the rest of the story. And so, starting in chapter 2 here with this idea of a kinsman from the family of Elimelech, whose name is Boaz, and then it's repeated in verse 3, saying this is important for the rest of the story. That Naomi has a relative. Well, we'll have to read on, and we'll talk about this in the coming weeks, about the importance of this relative, but it's worth noting here that this is important for the rest of the story. But we get a brief description of Boaz. The NASB here, it says he's a man of great wealth. The ESV says he's a worthy man. So it carries with it more than just this idea of wealth, but it's respect, how he's viewed in the community. So he's a man of valor, as it's used in another place in the Old Testament, a man of respect. And he's a relative of Naomi's dead husband. And then we switch to Ruth in verse 2. And once again, you see Ruth, the Moabitess. You hear this designation over and over again. She's a foreigner. She's an outsider. It's this idea that everywhere she went, she was reminded that she wasn't of the people of God. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." And there was a pastor this week in my study that I really appreciated some of the things he said. He says, at this point, Naomi is in her new home, away from the people she knows, away from family, lack of opportunity for husband, lack of opportunity in general, treated as an outsider, as a foreigner. And I'm sure she would have been tempted to go into a depression and stay in bed all day. But what I love that one pastor said, he said, and yet she didn't. She got up, washed her face, and said, there's work to be done. I'm going to do what I can do. And I think for us, as we consider this, there's much we can learn when we go through difficulty, when we go through tragedy. We're tempted to just retreat and isolate. But as this pastor in my study this week said, he said, get up, wash your face, and do something. Don't get stuck there. And in my study, I thought about this, that really, if we find ourselves in this kind of situation, we have one of two responses, usually. As Christians, we have one of two responses. Either one, we say, well, I'm going to wait on the Lord for him to show me what I'm supposed to do. And we sit and we wait. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait, and we don't do anything. Or our other response might be, I'm going to pretend as if God's not here, and I'm going to try to fix it all myself. I'll be the answer to my own problems. But I want us to see something here that Ruth does that I think we all can learn from. She gets up and says, what can I do that's I can be a change maker in? But within that, understanding that she's looking for favor. And yes, she's looking for favor specifically from landowners here, but there's also an aspect of looking for favor from God. So she gets up and says, what can I do? Well, you probably don't know this, but the law actually allowed for widows, orphans, foreigners to go to the fields. And you can read this in your the riveting passages of the law in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24. Not the most exciting passages, but within that, you see the law actually made a space for widows, foreigners, orphans, to go into the fields and actually pick up what was left. And actually the law called for landowners not to pick the crops all the way to the edge. They were to leave the edges for the foreigners, for the needy. And if they dropped something, they were to leave it. They weren't to pick it up, they were to leave it for the needy. And so it's possible that Ruth didn't know this, but it's possible that she did know this, and she said, this is something I can do. But understand, this is hard work. This wasn't her just going to pick up a check of support. This was her going to work all day for maybe a day or two's worth of food. And so she gets up and she says to her mother-in-law, please let me go and glean in the fields. But she also says, in seeking to find favor while being there. So you see this trust of, she gets up and she says, what can I do? But she also has this trust of, I'm trusting that God, Yahweh, the one true God, will direct me. And as I've said many times, this story feels very normal. It feels like normal life, experience. It doesn't feel overly spiritual, but as we continue to see this story, you see how God is directing lives for his sovereign purposes. So we continue. She says, "Can I go?" to her mother-in-law, "and I hope I can find favor." And her mother-in-law, Naomi, says to her, "Go, my daughter." So in verse 3, she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. So here's the repetition of this now. So it's saying, pay attention. Boaz, the family of Elimelech. This is important for you. But it's interesting here. The author almost uses some comedic irony here. She says, I'm going to go and seek favor. And then it says that she just happened to come to this portion, almost as if it's by chance. And literally in the Hebrew, it carries this idea of she happened to happen upon this. It actually is a repetition of the word. And so to the best of my ability, I tried to put this into English. And it's like, by chance, Ruth just happens to end up in this field. So as she's going, more than likely, this was a field that multiple landowners worked on. And they had sections of the field that they owned and they worked on. And so she comes to this field. She has her choice of places she can go. And by chance, she goes, this one looks nice. With no idea that this is actually a relative of her dead husband. And so she ends up in this field. She ends up gleaning there, picking up behind the reapers that were harvesting from the barley harvests. And then you see something interesting. Verse 4, Boaz comes from Bethlehem. So now Boaz actually enters the first scene that he's present in. At this point, Ruth is now in the field working. Boaz arrives from Bethlehem, and he says to the reapers, he arrives and he says, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. And this carries with it this idea, we would call this in the States a call and response. So every day he arrived, and when he arrived with his workers, he said to them, may the Lord be with you. And they responded, and the Lord bless you. Now, it would have been easy for him, in this case, this to be something that just, yeah, hey guys, good to see you. But you see something about the very character of Boaz, and even the way he enters the story. And I think there's something we can learn from this that's wonderful here. This wasn't just a Jew that was a Jew on the Sabbath. He was a follower of God all day, in every aspect of his life. Even down to his greeting to his workers in his field. So you see something about Boaz and his character. That he says, I trust that the Lord will be with you. And they respond, and the Lord will bless you. So you see, even in the workplace, there was a trust in Yahweh, the one true God. And so you see something about the character of Boaz. And then Boaz asks in verse 5, he asked his manager. This shows that he knows who works for him. He says, whose woman is that? There's somebody new in my field. Who's that? And more than likely what he's asking is he's saying, is this someone's servant that's working in our field? Is this someone's wife that's in our field? Who is this new woman? We have no indication as to what his motives were by this question, but he noticed her. And once again in verse 6, you see the manager's response in the way that outsiders were viewed and treated. She's the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. You don't know if he knows her name, but if he does, he doesn't use it. He says, oh, that's the Moabite woman. Oh, that's the outsider that came back with Naomi. And she had said to this manager, more than likely, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. And thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. And she's been sitting in the house for a little while. So she came and she said, I hope to go and find favor in the fields. In God's sovereign hand, she happened upon a relative's field. He's a God-fearing man. And one thing that's important to understand when we think about something like this, while the law allowed for foreigners and widows to glean in the fields, as with any laws, you're going to have those that loosely follow it, and you're going to have those that strictly follow it. And you may even have those that go above and beyond what the law says. And it would have been very possible for Ruth to end up in a field with someone that made it very difficult for her. It wasn't very helpful, and yet she ends up on the property of a man that's a relative by marriage, and a man that's a God-fearer that you see his character beginning to show here. And so she was allowed to glean, and it says she's been here all day. This was no small amount of work. And it says, and she's been sitting in the house for a little while. And so more than likely, this was a small covering or a small shed that was just off the side of the field. There was a place to rest. And so the manager says to Boaz, and she's sitting over there resting briefly now. And so we have a scene change again. And Boaz goes, let me go meet this person. And the next scene shows up, and we now look to the favor of Boaz. Turn my page. We now look to the favor of Boaz here in verses 8 through 10. And we see Boaz's first interaction with Ruth. And so he comes to Ruth after she's worked all day, and he says to her, listen carefully, my daughter. And many say when he says my daughter here, this is showing the age difference between him and her. He was an older man, probably within that unmarried, and he's speaking to this young Moabite woman, and he says, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go out from this one, but stay here with my maids. So he meets Ruth, and the first thing he says to her is, don't go anywhere else. Stay here, stay with my maids, stay with my workers. And what he's doing here is this was actually him saying, you have protection here. Because the truth is, a foreigner, a widow, was very vulnerable in that day. Could have been mistreated, could have been abused, could have been treated wrongly in so many different ways if she ended up in the wrong field with the wrong people. And so Boaz here says, listen carefully, don't go anywhere else. I will protect you. So you see, she was seeking favor, and in God's providential hand, in God's sovereign hand, she ends up in the perfect possible place with a guy that says, stay here and I'll protect you. Don't go to another field. And then in verse 9, he says, let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I've commanded the servants not to touch you. One pastor this week, I got a laugh out of this. He said this was like the first recorded sexual harassment policy in the workplace. He says, I've warned them, I've told them, don't even touch her. She's protected when she's on my property. So you see the care of Boaz here over Ruth. So you see he's saying, here you'll be protected. Here you'll be watched over. And not just that, he even ends and he says, and when you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. To us, we don't think much about that. We can walk into the kitchen and turn on the water. But in that day, more than likely, they had to go to the well in the morning. They had to carry the water all the way to the field. And so he says, don't worry about getting up early and getting the water. You can have our water. And more than likely, culturally, that would have been a no-no. They would have said, don't do that. She's a foreigner. She doesn't need to drink from the same water as us. And yet he says, no, you're safe here. You'll be fed here, and you'll have water here. And so you begin to see the kindness of Boaz. And actually, the pastor in the church where I did my internship in seminary, he makes this great connection. I loved it, so I want to give credit to him for this, but he makes a reference to Micah 6:8. And Micah 6:8 says, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" Micah 6:8, it basically says, in summarizing the active portion of our faith in following God, we're to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. And the pastor where I did my internship, he says about this, he says, is this not who Boaz is? He didn't just say, yes, you can glean here, yes, good luck to you. But he says, I will seek justice for you. I will protect you here. Stay here under my care. I will be kind to you. You have water here. And you see, he walks humbly with God. He enters the picture with, may the Lord be with you. So he's a man after God's heart. He's a picture of this Micah 6:8 passage. And so at this point, we see the response of Ruth. In verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? So she sees the kindness, the compassion of Boaz. And many of us would have been tempted at that point to say, finally, someone noticed me. But instead, we also see a bit of Ruth's heart here. She falls on her face in worship. Thank you for your kindness. What have I done to deserve this? For I am a foreigner. And so we see the favor of Boaz. And then finally, we look at the very favor of God in these final 3 verses, in verses 11 through 13. And I want us to understand, I say the favor of God, but understand God is using Boaz to show Ruth favor. And we'll see this as we continue through this here. And Boaz responds when she says, why me? I'm a foreigner. Boaz responds, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you didn't previously know. She says, why me? He says, oh, I know who you are. I know what you've done. It's been reported to me how you've treated your mother-in-law with respect, with care, leaving your people, leaving your land, leaving your family to follow Naomi and to follow Naomi's God, Yahweh, the one true God. So he says, I know who you are. And I've noticed what you've done. And now by chance, she's in his field. And then in verse 12, you see his response. And in many ways, this is like a prayer. He says about Ruth here, may the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. He says, I've noticed what you've done. And he says, and because of your sacrifice and your following of the one true God, he said, my prayer for you is this, that the Lord reward your work. That your wages be full from the Lord. And this is his way of saying that God bless you and show his favor to you. And why does he say this? He says that this be from the Lord. And just to clarify, just in case there's any confusion, he says the God of Israel. Yahweh, the one true God. And he says, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. He says, you left your people. You left your gods in Moab, and you came seeking refuge beneath the wings of the one true God. And the picture here is a picture of a baby bird protected beneath the wings of its mother. He says, I know what you've done. I know that you've committed your life to Yahweh, the one true God. You've committed your life to serve Naomi. And in many ways, I couldn't help but think, in many ways, this is the answer to Naomi's prayer for Ruth in chapter 1, verse 8. She said, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead. May the Lord show his loving kindness. We're beginning to see the Lord's loving kindness here. And even Boaz's prayer here, in many ways, Boaz is answering his own prayer. Boaz says, may the Lord reward your work and pay you back for all that you've done. And he may not even realize it at the time, but he is being the answer to his own prayer. And I think for us, there's something that we should consider in this. Oftentimes we hear of prayer needs. We even pray for things, but do we ever stop to consider if God has placed us in that very place to be the very answer to that prayer? What a difference we could make in the world around us if we didn't just pray, but then we said, can I help to be an answer to this prayer? Has God placed me here to be an answer to this prayer? And so, you see that he's noticed her commitment to Naomi and her commitment to God. And then you see in verse 13, then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. I have found favor in your sight is kind of her way of saying, thank you. Thank you for favor. I've been trying to figure out how to live, how to survive. And you see, she says, you've been kind. You've comforted me, even in the midst of her sorrow. She says, you've spoken kindly to me. So you see this comfort, kindness, and favor of Boaz here. And in many ways, it's the realization for Ruth here that this was the comfort, kindness, and favor of God himself through the life of Boaz. And we may be asking at this point, well, how does the story end? What happens next? We'll have to wait until next week. And the beauty of this story keeps going, and it builds, and we get to see what happens with this relationship between Boaz and Ruth. I think it's important for us always to keep in picture, in the bigger picture of this whole story of how God is working. In the midst of difficulty, in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of the pain of Naomi and Ruth, that God is not done with them. That God is moving in their lives. And even in the midst of what seem like normal events, she's doing her legal right to go and glean in the field, and yet in that, she's trusting that God is directing her. And we see the very favor of God as he places her in Boaz's field. And we see Boaz in his kindness, his compassion, his comfort, his favor, fulfilling in many ways Micah 6:8. Living that out, seeking justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God. And so, we'll continue this next week, but I want us to look at a few application questions as we close here. So I always want us to consider, how do we apply this to our lives? What does this mean for our lives? You know, this story of thousands and thousands of years ago, what does this mean for our belief? What does this mean for our actions? How do we think about this? So I have a few questions for us, hopefully, to help us apply this. Have you noticed how Ruth went out to do what she could do while also looking for the favor of God? Do you do the same? Do you control what you can control? And the things you can't control, do you place them in the very hands of God? Do we do the same? Second question, do you treat people with love, care, and respect like Boaz did? Do you see the least of these? The orphan, the widow, the outsider. I think if Christians, if we all lived like Boaz did, the world would look drastically different. Do we notice them? Do we notice the pain and the hurt of the people around us? Do we love, care, and respect them in the midst of that? The third question, when God works in your life, do you notice it and respond like Ruth with thankfulness and appreciation? Or do you say, finally, you noticed me? Or do we fall on our faces in worship and say, we've seen the very favor of God? Pray that that is our heart. And then the fourth and final question is, do you actively seek refuge under the wings of God? This is a question for Christians and non-Christians. If you're a Christian, do you actively seek the very refuge beneath the wings of God? Protection. Are you going to him seeking for help, running to him for protection, running to him for favor? Or do you as a Christian say, I think I can handle it on my own? I can fix this problem. Or do we instead go and seek refuge under the wings of God? And if you're here and you're not a Christian, truth is you've never sought the refuge of God. Not in an eternal sense. So I ask, will you seek refuge beneath God's wings? Is he the place that you'll run? And the only way we can find refuge beneath God's wings is through Jesus. And so if you're here and you're not a Christian, you want to hear more about what it means to follow Jesus, I'd love to talk to you about that.